Rain poured over the empty streets that night, turning the city lights into blurred streaks of gold and sorrow. Beneath a flickering street lamp, a woman sat on the cold pavement, soaked to the bone, clutching a warm blanket around her shoulders. She wasn't invisible. Not tonight. Her cries echoed softly through the night air, carried by the wind that cut through her fragile frame. But when a patrol car pulled up beside her, hope sparked in her weary eyes. The man behind the badge looked at her, his face expressionless. He rolled down his window, listened to her trembling voice for a moment, and then drove away. She watched the red and blue lights fade into the distance, her heart sinking deeper than the puddles at her feet. That officer had the power to help, but chose not to. To him, she was just another nameless face in the city's forgotten corners, someone too far gone to matter. What he didn't realize was that his moment of cold indifference would soon come back to him in ways he could never imagine. Because that night, someone else had been watching, someone who lived by a code far older than the law, a code written not on paper, but in loyalty, honor, and justice. A few blocks away, a group of bikers sat under the awning of a 24-hour diner, their engines still warm from the rain. They had seen the whole thing. To the world, they were the outlaws, the Hells Angels, the ones people crossed the street to avoid. But to the broken, the forgotten, and the lost, they were something else entirely, protectors. And as they watched that officer drive away, something inside them shifted. They didn't care about his badge or his authority. What they cared about was the woman left crying in the rain while the man who was supposed to protect her turned his back. One of the riders, a veteran with eyes like steel and a heart too familiar with pain, stood up and said, "No one gets left like that. Not in our town." The others nodded, the hum of their engines growing louder as the rain poured harder. They helped the woman to her feet, wrapped her in a dry jacket, and promised her one thing: that the man who ignored her would understand what it truly meant to be helpless. Not for revenge, but for redemption. Because sometimes the only way to teach compassion is through experience. By the time dawn broke, the rain had stopped, but the storm was far from over. The officer who had looked away would soon find himself face to face with the consequences of his indifference. And this time, he wouldn't be able to drive off. What was coming for him wasn't punishment, it was a lesson. One that would strip away his pride, test his humanity, and show him a truth no badge could protect him from. Empathy isn't weakness, it's justice in its purest form. The next morning, the city woke under a gray sky, but for Officer Miller, the world looked just the same: routine, predictable, and comfortably detached. He sipped his coffee, checked his patrol schedule, and tried not to think about the woman from last night. For a brief moment, her face had lingered in his mind, those trembling hands, those pleading eyes, but he brushed it off. "She's not my responsibility," he told himself. He had a quota to meet, reports to file, and a reputation to keep. Compassion, in his world, was a distraction. But not everyone had forgotten her. The bikers had spent the rest of that night searching for the woman's shelter, making sure she had food, dry clothes, and a place to rest. They didn't ask for thanks. They just did what needed to be done. And as she fell asleep, one of them stayed behind, staring out the window into the empty street. "People I can forget we're all one bad day away from being out here," he murmured. His brothers nodded in silence, knowing that truth too well. They had all been broken once, by war, loss, addiction, or fate, but somewhere along the road, they found purpose again. And now, they were about to make sure the officer learned what they had. A few days later, Officer Miller's shift started like any other. Same patrol, same streets, same sense of authority, until his radio crackled with a report: an abandoned vehicle under the old bridge. He drove there alone, expecting another routine call. But when he arrived, the air felt different. The sound of engines rumbled softly in the distance. A dozen motorcycles surrounded the area, parked in a circle beneath the bridge, their chrome gleaming in the fading light. He stepped out of his car, cautiously, one hand on his belt, scanning the figures watching him. The leader stepped forward, a tall man with a leather jacket patched with the unmistakable symbol of the Hells Angels. His face was calm, his voice steady. "Evening, officer. We've been expecting you." Miller frowned, tried to assert control. "What's going on here? This is private property. Move along before." The man interrupted him with a quiet chuckle. Before what? You arrest us for caring. The officer froze, unsure how to respond. The air grew heavy as the riders stood behind their leader, not threatening, but unwavering. Then, from behind the circle, the woman stepped forward. Clean now, wearing a jacket that clearly wasn't hers, her eyes met his, and he felt a chill run down his spine. Do you remember me? She asked softly. His mouth went dry. He wanted to deny it, to hide behind protocol, but he couldn't. The guilt hit him like a wave. For the first time, the weight of what he'd done, the coldness he'd shown, pressed down on him. The leader looked at him and said quietly, she needed help that night. You had the power to save her, and you chose not to. The officer's voice cracked as he tried to defend himself. I couldn't. There were calls, procedures, but his excuses felt empty, even to his own ears. The leader didn't raise his voice. We're not here to hurt you, he said. We're here to make you understand. With that, he nodded to his brothers. Two of them stepped forward, leading the officer to a nearby alleyway where a group of volunteers had set up food and blankets for the homeless. Look around, the leader said. This is where she sleeps. Where they all sleep. Miller looked around. The smell of damp cardboard, the sight of old men huddled against walls, children wrapped in torn blankets. It wasn't a scene he was used to facing up close. In his patrol car, these people were statistics, names on reports, problems to be moved along. But here, they were real. Every face had a story. Every pair of eyes looked back at him, with a quiet pain he had ignored for years. And standing there, surrounded by those he'd once dismissed as cases, Miller felt smaller than he ever had in his life. One of the bikers approached, his arms crossed, tattoos peeking out from under his sleeves. You think we're the bad guys, don't you? He asked. You look at us and see criminals. But the truth is, we've been where they are. We've seen hell. And when we got out, we made a promise to never walk away from someone crying for help. Miller didn't answer. He couldn't, because deep down, he knew he had become exactly the kind of man he once swore he'd never be. The woman stepped closer, her voice trembling but strong. When you drove away, I thought maybe I really didn't matter. But they showed me I was wrong. They showed me kindness. Her words hit harder than any accusation. For the first time, the officer saw what his indifference had cost, not just her dignity, but her faith in humanity. He looked at the riders, at the woman, and felt something break inside him. The kind of breaking that doesn't destroy, it rebuilds. As he stood there, the leader placed a hand on his shoulder. We don't need an apology, officer. We just need you to see. Because once you truly see, you can't turn away again. The engines roared to life behind them, echoing under the bridge like thunder. Miller watched as the bikers mounted their motorcycles, the woman climbing onto the back of one. As they rode off into the night, their taillights glowed like embers in the dark, a moving symbol of redemption, justice, and something he had forgotten long ago, compassion. That night, Officer Miller didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, the rain dripping from her hair, the quiet pain in her voice, the look she gave him under that bridge. The sound of the bikers' engines echoed in his mind like a heartbeat he couldn't silence. For the first time in years, he questioned the man he had become. Somewhere along the line, behind the badge and the rules, he had lost what had once made him human. He had traded compassion for control, empathy for efficiency. And now, the weight of that trade felt unbearable. The next morning, he drove without direction, passing the same corners he used to patrol with indifference. But now, he saw everything differently. The man sitting on the sidewalk wasn't a nuisance. He was someone's father. The woman rummaging through a trash can wasn't invisible anymore. She was someone's daughter. The cries he used to ignore now echoed in his chest like thunder. Every face was a mirror, reflecting back the truth he had avoided. That humanity dies not from cruelty alone, but from the quiet apathy of those who could help and choose not to. Determined to make things right, Miller went back to the shelter where the woman had been taken. She wasn't there, but the volunteers remembered him. She left this morning, one of them said. Said she was heading to a rehab center the bikers helped her find. The word struck him. He had dismissed those men as lawless outcasts, but they had done more for her in one night than he had done in years of service. Without thinking, he asked for directions and drove there, hoping to see her, to tell her that he was sorry, even if words would never be enough. When he arrived, the staff recognized her description immediately. "She's doing better," one of them said with a soft smile. "It's not easy, but she's trying." Miller nodded, relief flooding through him. For the first time, he didn't feel like an officer. He felt like a man trying to make peace with himself. He left a small envelope at the reception desk, addressed to her. Inside, a handwritten note read, "You reminded me what my badge was supposed to mean. Thank you for saving me, too." As he stepped outside, the sound of motorcycles approached in the distance. He turned to see the same group of riders pulling into the lot. Their leader dismounted first, his eyes locking with Miller's. For a moment, the two men said nothing. Then the biker nodded once, not in mockery, but in acknowledgement. Respect, silent and genuine, passed between them. It was enough. Without a word, the bikers revved their engines and rode off again, the roar fading into the horizon. Miller watched them go, a faint smile touching his lips. This time, he didn't feel judged. He felt understood. Days turned into weeks, and though the city's noise returned to normal, something inside Officer Miller had changed forever. He started volunteering during his off hours, bringing blankets, food, and coffee to the same people he once ignored. The department noticed, of course. Some mocked him, calling it guilt or weakness. But others, especially the younger officers, began to follow his lead. He didn't lecture them. He just showed them. Compassion wasn't a weakness. It was the truest form of strength a man could have. One evening, while on patrol, Miller spotted a familiar figure standing at a bus stop. It was her, the woman from the rain. She looked healthier now, her eyes brighter, her posture stronger. She smiled when she saw him, and he felt a lump rise in his throat. "You kept your promise," she said. He blinked, confused. "What promise?" She laughed softly. "That night under the bridge, the biker told me you'd learn." I didn't believe him. "But look at you now." Miller chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "I'm still learning," he said. "Every day." They talked for a while, about her progress, about the bikers who still checked on her, about how kindness from strangers had saved her life. When the bus arrived, she paused before boarding. "You know," she said, "it's strange. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up teaching us the greatest lessons." Miller nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "And sometimes the ones we ignore become our greatest teachers." As the bus pulled away, he stood on the sidewalk, the cold wind brushing against his face, carrying with it a strange warmth he hadn't felt in years, peace. Later that week, he drove out to a quiet stretch of highway where he knew the bikers often gathered. He found them sitting by a campfire, their motorcycles lined up against the glow of the setting sun. When they saw him, they didn't reach for their helmets or prepare for confrontation. They simply gestured for him to sit. And he did. For the next few hours, they talked, not about law or rebellion, but about life, pain, and second chances. The lines between them blurred. They were no longer a cop and bikers. They were just men who had learned what it meant to fall and get back up again. That night, as Miller drove home, he caught his reflection in the mirror. The badge on his chest looked different now. Not like a symbol of power, but of duty. Real duty. The kind that means listening when someone cries, helping without expecting thanks, and remembering that authority without empathy is nothing but emptiness. The rain began to fall again, soft and steady. But this time, he didn't see it as something cold. He saw it as cleansing, a chance to begin again. Weeks passed, and Officer Miller's transformation began to ripple through the precinct like an invisible tide. The man once known for his cold detachment had become something else entirely, a quiet force of change. He didn't make speeches or seek credit. He simply acted differently. When his fellow officers brushed off a call from a homeless camp, he volunteered to go. When a young recruit joked about wasting time on people who'd made bad choices, Miller didn't scold him. He told him a story. A story about a woman crying in the rain, a man who ignored her, and the riders who reminded him of his humanity. The young officer didn't laugh after that. But not everyone approved. Some of the higher-ups warned him to keep his compassion in check, insisting that police work required distance, not emotion. Miller listened quietly, but didn't argue. He knew better now. Distance had been his cage. It had blinded him to the world's pain and his own. Now that he'd broken free, he refused to return to that numbness. "If feeling makes me weaker," he once told a colleague, Then I'd rather be weak and human than strong and hollow. Those words spread through the station like wildfire, sparking conversations no policy could suppress. One evening, he drove past the same street where it had all begun, the corner where the rain had fallen and the woman had cried for help. It was quiet now, just the hum of streetlights and the soft whisper of wind. He pulled over and sat there for a while, remembering. The shame that had once burned him no longer stung. Instead, it felt like a scar, healed but never forgotten. Because some wounds aren't meant to disappear. They're meant to remind us of who we can become if we choose differently next time. Then, as if fate were watching, he heard the familiar rumble of engines in the distance. A line of headlights appeared over the hill, and the Hells Angels rode past, strong, steady, unstoppable. Their leader caught his eye and raised 2 fingers in silent salute. Miller smiled and returned the gesture. No words were exchanged, but none were needed. They both understood. The lesson had been learned, the message passed on. The cop who once ignored compassion had become its messenger. As the bikers vanished down the road, Miller leaned back in his seat, the city lights reflecting off his windshield. The world hadn't changed overnight, but he had. And maybe that was enough. Because change doesn't begin with movements or speeches. It begins with a single moment. One person deciding to care when it would be easier not to. Months later, the department started a new initiative to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the homeless community. Miller was asked to lead it. He didn't hesitate. He worked side by side with volunteers, shelters, and even the biker clubs that had once been considered a problem. The media called it an unlikely alliance, but to him, it was the most natural thing in the world. They weren't enemies. They were all fighting for the same thing, dignity. The first time the woman he'd once ignored volunteered at one of the outreach events, he almost didn't recognize her. She was radiant, confident, smiling, alive. She walked up to him, holding a box of supplies. "Looks like we both found new jobs," she said with a grin. He laughed softly, the weight of the past now replaced by mutual respect. Together, they handed out meals and blankets, side by side, without a word about the night that had started it all. It didn't need to be spoken. The silence between them carried a kind of peace words could never describe. Later that day, a young girl approached Miller, tugging on his sleeve. "Are you a real cop?" she asked. He nodded, smiling. "Then how come bikers are helping you?" He chuckled. "Because sometimes, the people who look the toughest have the biggest hearts." The girl frowned, processing his answer. "So, not all heroes wear uniforms." He paused, then knelt down beside her. "No," he said gently. "Some wear leather and ride motorcycles." That night, as he closed the precinct, Miller stood by the window, watching the rain return once more. But this time, instead of feeling guilt, he felt gratitude. The rain wasn't a reminder of failure. It was a symbol of cleansing, of renewal. Every drop that hit the pavement was a whisper of redemption, a song of second chances. And somewhere out there, he knew, the riders were still patrolling the streets, not with authority, but with compassion. He looked down at his badge, its shine dulled by years of use, and whispered to himself, "It's not what you carry on your chest that makes you honorable. It's what you carry in your heart." Then, with a quiet resolve, he stepped out into the rain, no longer a man haunted by his past, but one guided by it. The city stretched before him, full of people who needed someone to see them, to listen, to care. And this time, he was ready. As months turned into years, Officer Miller became something the city hadn't seen in a long time, a man in uniform who inspired trust instead of fear. His reputation grew quietly, not because of arrests or authority, but because of empathy. People began to recognize his patrol car, not as a symbol of control, but of hope. He didn't pass by those on the sidewalks anymore. He stopped, listened, and learned their names. Each face became a story, each story a reminder that humanity is the one law that should never be broken. The department changed with him. Slowly, other officers followed his lead. The station walls, once echoing with cynicism, began to hold real conversations about compassion, mental health, and dignity. Miller started a mentorship program for new recruits, teaching them what he wished someone had told him years ago. "We protect people, not reputations. The badge isn't armor, it's a promise." His words resonated far beyond the precinct. News outlets began calling him the cop with the heart of a biker, a nickname he wore with pride. But despite the praise, Miller remained humble. He knew his redemption didn't make him a hero, it just made him human again. He often thought of the woman who had unknowingly changed his life, and the writers who had forced him to see what he had become. He owed them everything. Sometimes, on his days off, he'd take long drives down the highway, half expecting to see the roar of chrome and leather in the distance. And whenever he did, he'd slow down, smile, and let them pass, knowing that some debts aren't meant to be repaid, only honored. One afternoon, during one of these drives, he stopped at a roadside diner, a place he hadn't been to in years. To his surprise, the walls are lined with photos of local heroes, firefighters, paramedics, veterans, and right in the center, a framed photo of the Hells Angels handing out food to the homeless. The caption read, "Not all angels have wings." He smiled, feeling a lump form in his throat. It wasn't the kind of tribute that made headlines, but it was the kind that lasted. That night, he returned to the precinct and found a note waiting on his desk. No signature, no name, just a single sentence. "We ride for the ones who see again." His chest tightened as he read it, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, picturing the same roar of engines that had once terrified him. But now, it brought him peace. Somewhere out there, his unlikely brothers were still watching, still reminding the world that justice without compassion isn't justice at all. Winter came again, and with it, another cold night of rain. The streets were slick, the air biting. Miller was on his usual patrol when he saw her, a young woman sitting on the curb, shivering, eyes red from crying. She looked exactly like the woman he had once ignored years ago, and for a split second, time seemed to stop. But this time, he didn't hesitate. He parked, stepped out into the rain, and crouched beside her. "Hey," he said softly, "you don't have to sit here alone. Let's get you somewhere warm." She blinked, startled. "You're a cop." He nodded, smiling. "Yeah, but don't hold that against me." She laughed weakly through her tears, and something in that sound made his heart ache. It reminded him of the fragile hope he'd once seen in another's eyes. He gave her his jacket and drove her to a nearby shelter, staying until he knew she'd be okay. Before he left, she asked, "Why did you stop?" He thought for a moment before answering. "Because someone once taught me what happens when you don't." When he got back in his car, he sat for a long while, the rain drumming softly on the windshield. In the rearview mirror, he saw his own reflection, not the stern, hardened officer from years ago, but a man who had learned that empathy could be stronger than any badge. He thought of the Hells Angels, of the way they had stood beneath that bridge, unafraid to challenge him, not with violence, but with truth. They hadn't destroyed him, they had rebuilt him. As he drove through the sleeping city, he saw the faint glow of motorcycle headlights far ahead. They weren't close enough to recognize, but he knew who they were. The angels never vanished completely. They just appeared when the world needed reminding that goodness doesn't always wear a uniform. He slowed down, watching the red taillights disappear into the mist, and whispered, "Thank you." The wind carried his words, scattering them into the night like a prayer. And in that quiet, rain-soaked moment, Miller understood something profound. That compassion wasn't a single act, but a lifelong choice. A decision made again and again, every time someone cries and the world looks away. He smiled, turned on his siren, and drove back into the night, not as a man haunted by his past, but as one redeemed by it. Time passed, and the city slowly began to reflect the man Miller had become. His work inspired other departments, and soon, similar outreach programs spread across nearby towns. Officers who had once dismissed the idea of compassion now carried food in their patrol cars, blankets in their trunks, and understanding in their hearts. For Miller, that was the true measure of justice, not in arrests or citations, but in the lives quietly changed. He often thought about how one simple act of cruelty had set off a chain reaction of kindness, proving that redemption doesn't always begin with doing right. It sometimes begins with realizing you were wrong. The woman he once ignored had rebuilt her life, too. She worked full-time at the same shelter that had taken her in, dedicating her days to helping others find the same strength she had discovered. When Miller visited, they would share coffee and stories about the people they'd met, the lost, the forgotten, the redeemed. There was a bond between them that needed no words, a shared understanding that both had been saved in their own way that night beneath the bridge. One by a group of bikers who carried justice in their hearts, the other by the painful mirror of his own indifference. Every year, on the anniversary of that night, Miller drove to the same bridge. It was no longer dark and forgotten. The city had renovated it, installing lights and benches. A plaque on the wall read, "In honor of those who choose compassion when no one else will." He would stand there for a long time, listening to the faint hum of traffic above and the whisper of wind below. Sometimes, the deep rumble of motorcycles echoed in the distance. He never saw where they came from, but he always knew who they were. One year, as he stood there, a child approached him holding a small toy bike. "My mom says you helped her when she was cold," the boy said proudly. "She says you're her hero." Miller knelt, smiling softly. "I'm no hero, kid," he said gently. "I just learned from the best." The boy looked confused. "The best?" Miller nodded toward the horizon, where the fading sun glinted off a faraway line of moving headlights. "Yeah," he whispered. "The ones who ride." That night, as he drove home, the rain began to fall once more. The streets shimmered with reflections of light, city lamps, passing cars, and the endless flicker of red tail lights fading into the mist. But instead of sadness, the rain brought peace, because he knew now that every drop carried a lesson, and every storm carried renewal. And in that knowledge, he found the one thing he thought he had lost forever: purpose. Years later, long after Miller had retired, the legend of the bridge and the bikers had become part of the city's folklore. New officers told the story to rookies as a reminder of empathy's power. The plaque remained untouched, flowers left at its base year after year. People didn't remember every detail, but they remembered the lesson: that compassion could change the course of a life, that kindness could echo louder than authority. Miller, now older and slower, lived on the outskirts of town, near the open road he once feared and then learned to love. He spent his mornings watching the horizon, listening for the sound that had shaped his life: the low, rolling thunder of motorcycles. Sometimes, when the engines roared in the distance, he'd close his eyes and smile. They never stopped riding, he thought. The angels were still out there, still watching, still reminding the world that justice without mercy was just another kind of cruelty. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, he heard it again, the unmistakable hum of engines growing closer. He stepped outside and saw them coming, one by one, their headlights cutting through the dusk. They didn't stop at his house, didn't say a word. They simply slowed as they passed, their leader raising 2 fingers to his helmet in salute. Miller placed a hand over his heart, returning the gesture. No words were spoken, but everything was understood. As they disappeared into the horizon, he stood in the fading light, feeling the same peace he had found years ago beneath that bridge. His journey had come full circle, from blindness to awareness, from authority to empathy. He wasn't the man who ignored pain anymore. He had become the man who answered it. The sound of the engines grew faint, blending with the wind, until all that remained was silence and the echo of redemption. Inside, on his kitchen wall, hung a photograph, one he kept framed for years. It showed a group of bikers standing in the rain beside a weeping woman, their silhouettes illuminated by a single streetlight. Beneath it, a simple inscription read, "Never look away." Miller smiled, turned off the light, and sat by the window as night fell over the quiet town. Somewhere out there, the road stretched endlessly, carrying the roar of angels who reminded the world, one act of compassion can change everything. Some stories aren't meant to fade. They're meant to remind us of what it truly means to be human. The story of Officer Miller, the homeless woman, and the riders who refused to look away isn't about punishment or vengeance. It's about transformation. It's about how one act of indifference can ripple into regret, and how one act of compassion can ripple into redemption. It showed us that justice without empathy is empty, but empathy, real, raw, and fearless, has the power to change everything. Miller's journey became more than a personal redemption. It became a mirror for all of us. Because somewhere, we've all been both the one who walked away and the one who cried for help. We've all had moments where it was easier to stay silent than to step forward. But this story asks a question that lingers long after the engines fade. What kind of person do you want to be when someone else needs you most? The answer doesn't live in titles or uniforms. It lives in the choices we make when no one's watching. The Hells Angels didn't teach that lesson with words. They taught it through action, through courage, through compassion in its purest form. They proved that even those labeled as outlaws could carry the light the world forgets it needs. And through their actions, they reminded us of something we often overlook: kindness isn't weakness. It's rebellion against the coldness of the world. Every time we choose to care, we are defying a system that tells us not to. Miller found his redemption not because he wore a badge, but because he rediscovered his heart. He learned that power means nothing without purpose, and that forgiveness begins the moment we stop running from the truth. And maybe that's the message this story leaves behind, that no matter how far we've gone, there is always a road back. The difference between who we were and who we can become is just one act of courage away. If this story touched you, don't let it end here. Share in the comments what it made you feel. Your words might be the sign someone else needs to keep going. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story that reminds us of the strength still hidden in humanity. And leave a like if you believe that compassion can still rewrite even the coldest stories. Because in the end, the world doesn't remember who looked away, it remembers who chose to care.